Welcome back. In a shocking turn of events, after weeks of anti-Israel rallies all over the world, Russia witnessed a full-blown episode of anti-Jew hatred spilling onto the streets. Hundreds of Russian Muslims stormed into the main airport at Russia's Dagestan region while chanting anti-Semitic slogans. They reportedly entered the airport to look for Jews who were arriving on a flight from Tel Aviv. It then escalated as they fired warning shots to push security forces back. A standoff took place between security forces and the mob on the tarmac of the airport as well. Some of those who were part of the mob carried Palestine flags. Dagestan's Ministry of Health said that more than 20 people were injured, with 2 critical. It said the injured included police, officers and civilians. The big issue today is anti-Israel narrative, hatred or politics descending into openly anti-Jew hatred onto the streets. Adam Scott Bellos is CEO of the Israel Innovation Fund, and Sushant Sareen, Senior Fellow, ORF, continues to be with us. Adam, thanks a lot for your time. How are you looking at the events, not just in Russia, but the fact that there are a lot of rallies, for example, in New York, in Sydney, where we've had either openly anti-Semitic slogans or symbols being displayed. There have been stray incidents of Jews being attacked, and now this mob that almost descended to, quote, hunt for Jews in Russia.
What's the question exactly?
What exactly do you make of these turn of events? Do you feel this is anti-Jew hatred that was masked under anti-Israel politics?
Okay, I don't interpret these events to be anything different from the anti-Israel riots and not only riots but parades and protests that we've seen over the past 20 years. For years, everybody has been trying to make the argument that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, but anybody knows that Jew hatred has evolved from a religious hatred to a racial hatred and now a national hatred, constantly denying our peoplehood, our civilization, and our nationhood. This is anti-Semitism. This is anti-Jew hatred. The only people that would be anti-Zionist are those who do not believe that Israel and the Jewish people have the right to self-determination, independence, and statehood. So what do I make of it? I make of it that for the past 20 years, many people have been ignoring the realities on the ground, constantly trying to do different PR efforts in order to rehabilitate the image of the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, or the state of Israel. And that has never, ever worked and never would work, given the fact that anti-Semitism and Jew hatred has been something so deep-seated in the world for the last 2,500 years, and that has mutated into different things. Okay. The religious hatred, its apex was the Spanish Inquisition. The racial rejection, its apex was the Holocaust. Anti-Zionism and the anti-national rejection of the Jewish people, its apex was October 7th.
But, you know, this kind of anti-Semitism, while there are a lot of people raising their voices against it, it also seems to have a lot of supporters. Now, in this modern era, Adam, you wouldn't actually see any kind of open justification for any kind of movement or action, slogans, targeting of any community. But for some reason, people are making excuses for these anti-Jew statements or rallies.
Of course they are. It's because they're anti-Semitic. They're anti-Jewish. Think about it. For years, everybody has been saying, this isn't about the Jewish people. This is about Israel. Well, what do Jews landing in Russia have to do with this? What do Jews in Washington, D.C. have to do with this? In San Francisco, in Sydney, Australia, they were screaming, gas the Jews.
Yeah.
The Palestinian National Resistance Movement, okay, has always been an anti-Jewish, anti-Jew hatred, a Jew hatred movement. This has never been about what people say. When they say it's about Zionism, the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, the movement of self-determination, okay, it's a bunch of baloney, malarkey, as Joe Biden would like to say. He loves to use that term. The fact is that this is about one thing: Jew hatred, that has been a systemic problem in the world for 2,500 years, since the Jewish people were the very first victims of Western imperialism and colonialism by the Romans when we were exiled from our land for the second time. It's extremely important to realize this is not about Israel. This is about the radical Islamic goal of retaking all of their lost territories of Dar al-Islam, okay, and completely and utterly eliminating any problem or obstacle in that path. The state of Israel, the Jewish people's national home, is the main obstacle to that goal.
Okay.
Plain and simple.
Before I go to Sushant, I do want to ask you, how worried are you about this rising trend? And do you feel Western governments or governments anywhere in the world have done enough to stand against this open anti-Semitism?
I'm completely and utterly worried for every Jew all over the world. I actually believe that Jews are much safer in Israel, even after October 7th, than they are anywhere else in the world. If you ever watched my show, Wine with Adam, that was quite popular in Israel, my last episode before the war started was with the former ambassador from the United States, Tom Nides, where we discussed the Biden administration's anti-Semitism policy. And it was hailed as the very first anti-Semitism policy in the modern world. And when I said I had read it, the response was, "Oh, did you like it?" And immediately I said, "No, how could I like it?" It was a one-sided policy dealing with right-wing extremism and white supremacy and anti-Jewish hatred on the side of the right. It did not fully encompass the problem of anti-Semitism from both left to right, right to left. It's very important to understand this is an entire ideology that has been brewing for 20, 30 years.
Okay.
No one is prepared for it. Even the Jewish community is not prepared for it. There's no self-defense classes being given for free in Jewish day schools, synagogues, and community centers. The Jewish community has not prepared for this. The American government has not prepared for this. The only safe place for Jews will be the state of Israel because it is our national homeland and it is our safety net.
Okay. Sushant, I have a couple of minutes. Thanks a lot for your patience. You know, in India, historically, we've seen absolutely no anti-Jew sentiment. It is one of those countries where Jews have not only, been repatriated and rehabilitated and have lived very peacefully and very protectedly. But there are concerns for India from what kind of sentiment we're seeing, burgeoning across the world. And there seems to be some sort of intellectual cover fire or, justification for these kind of protests or even openly anti-Semitic moves around the world. Do you feel there could be any concern for India as the aftermath is in this aftermath?
Look, I think there is going to be a problem out here as well. And we've seen that on some of the, in some of the street protests out here. Although it's still a very small, isolated kind of protests that are taking place by a few specific parties, mostly Islamist parties, backed by the typical leftist communist crowd. But look, Shivani, there are two things out here. One is that, just as Adam is talking about, how Jews and Zionism are being conflated, and then it's basically anti-Jew hatred, which is then given the cover of being anti-Zionist, and then, everything becomes kosher, you can go ahead and target anybody, right? Is the same way they are defending Hamas by talking about Palestine, when in effect, they are defending what Hamas did. They're not talking about Hamas. They say, no, Hamas we condemn, but we are talking about Palestinian right. So that conflation is taking place. Let's be very clear about what is happening. Secondly, I think what has happened is that, especially in the West, and then it filters down to India, what has been happening is that a climate of permissiveness has been allowed where it's perfectly fine for Muslim mobs to come out and then, shout out the most vicious kind of anti-Semitic stuff. And nobody really takes notice of it that, okay, it's some people just letting off steam. This is not, we've seen it on the streets of London, for example. Over so many decades now it has been happening, but the Brits have just turned a blind eye to it. Either they are too scared to take these guys on, or they're complicit with these guys. The same thing we've seen in other Western countries, and they have simply ignored it. Now it has reached a point where the kind of scenes which you saw around the world after October 7th, but then yesterday in Dagestan, this is something which is now becoming these kind of flash mobs. Suddenly these mobs are organized. And what were they attacking yesterday in Dagestan? A flight which had come from Israel, but apparently carrying children or some people who had gone to Israel for, charity, for a charity which was giving them free medical treatment.
Right.
Can you imagine? And even that was held against those people, and they would have lynched, had they got their hands on anybody, this mob would have lynched those people. And they would have justified it. in the name of whatever,
Absolutely.
whatever
The
they want to
permissibility
justify.
that you talked about is the dangerous trend here, and that permissibility is not for anybody else. Even one
And it's
comment by a stray
Look,
voice on
Shivani,
any
can
other
I take
community is
10
not
seconds?
condoned and actually is conflated with the
Can I take
entire
10
community. Very quickly, Sushant, I have 10 seconds.
So I think it is a wake-up call for Indian political parties, regardless of what your position on
Sure.
Palestine issue and everything is, that you cannot sanctify, you cannot permit this kind of language in India, because then this thing spreads, and if you come into power either in a state or in the center, then this becomes the norm, and I think we all need to guard against that.
All right. I've run out of time. I do thank both of our guests for joining us and sharing their thoughts on this very troubling trend that we're seeing increasing across the world. With that, it's time for me to take your leave. Rahul Shivshankar is joining you on the other side.